Portman is a Republican from Ohio, but he is also the former director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Bush. Senator, thanks very much for being with us.
John, thanks for having me on.
The Boehner plan, which is what seems to be the big argument of the moment, would cut about $900 billion from the deficit over 10 years. It would allow an additional $1.6 trillion increase, as I understand it, in the debt limit, but only if Congress votes to reduce spending by that amount, at least that amount, over the term in which it is raised. Does that sound good to you? I mean, is that something you would vote for?
Well, John, you're right. It's about $917 billion right away, and then it's another $1.8 trillion actually through this joint committee, which would report by the end of this year. So the total amount is about $2.7 trillion. I just heard the White House spokesperson talking about the fact that those cuts are somehow less than the cuts that they are supporting. That's actually not accurate. The cuts that they are supporting, which is Mr. Reid's bill, has cuts of about $940 billion. Then it does set up a committee as well, but that committee is not subject to any kind of pressure because there are no consequences for it not reporting. In other words, it isn't related to the next debt ceiling. So to try to go through all the confusing numbers you just heard from the White House briefing, I would say that, one, the Boehner proposal has more cuts and has the possibility of actually creating the tax reform we need and the entitlement reforms that we need through having it tied to the second debt limit increase. The Reid plan that they're supporting has the guarantee only of less than $1 trillion worth of cuts versus the Boehner possibility of 2.7. So, these are very different proposals in that regard. I will say that where the White House has continued to miss the boat is that the House and Senate proposals both have spending cuts, both have a process with a committee, and both do not include tax increases, which is what the president continues to call for. On Monday night, as you know, knowing that there was no plan on the Hill calling for tax increases, the president continued to say we needed to raise taxes on a weak economy. So that's kind of the bidding right now. I think the Boehner proposal has a good prospect of getting passed in the House, and I hope that it's one that we can support in the Senate.
The president's spokesman there was sort of speaking wistfully about a time when these debt ceiling increase votes were routine. You yourself have pointed out that 34 of the last 44 of them have been for less than a year. So a short-term increase, which the White House now seems to be rebelling against just a bit. They want to push the vote, any next vote, if we get one now, they want to push the next one past the next presidential election. That seems to defy convention, doesn't it?
It does. John, you're absolutely right. The norm has been shorter term. And by the way, I don't wistfully remember all of those fights, having been at the Office of Management and Budget and having been on the House side. I think maybe he wasn't there for some of those fights. There are often big fights that are connected with this because the American people and, by the way, the markets want to know that when you're extending the ability to borrow, that you're dealing with the underlying problem, and that's the debt. So again, where I would disagree with the White House position right now, they are saying that you need to have a long-term commitment in order to avoid economic disruption. We are saying that you need to have serious debt limits that are reducing spending now in order to extend to deal with the underlying problem, that's what the economy is really looking for. If you look at what Standard & Poor's and Fitch and Moody's and others have said, they have said, yes, we need to extend the debt limit. And I agree with that, by the way. That's necessary. But it's not sufficient. We also have to deal with the underlying problem. And the Boehner proposal has a much more aggressive approach to reducing spending over this time period. So I think actually for the economy and for the markets, the Boehner proposal would get the better response. And frankly, it's the least that we should be doing.
I want to read you a quote from the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and I'm guessing that you haven't heard it. She was asked this morning at her regular weekly news briefing about the upcoming resignation of outgoing Democratic Congressman David Wu. She said, that's the last thing on my mind. What we're trying to do, she said, is save the world from the Republican budget. We're trying to save life on this planet as we know it today. Is that a bit of hyperbole, Senator?
It certainly sounds like it, John. I don't know what a more extreme word than hyperbole might be to describe it. But look, here's life on the planet today is better than it would be because America has always been a leading economic force, at least in the last century. we've been the country people have turned to as a model to how free market capitalism can work. And that is at stake here in the sense that if we don't get our budget problems under control with record deficits and debts, and we don't begin to deal with these underlying issues, we will become more like Greece. And that's what the credit agencies are telling us. That's what all the economists are telling us. And so I heard what the White House spokesperson said about the reductions in spending in the Boehner plan. I now hear what Mrs. Pelosi is saying. They're saying it cuts too much. I think in reality we aren't doing enough yet, but at least we have to do what's provided for in the Boehner proposal to actually begin the process of changing this trajectory of mounting deficits and debts. So life on the planet as we know it may not be at stake here, but I think the economic well-being of the United States is at stake, and that does affect the entire globe, and it does affect what our kids and grandkids are going to inherit. And we've got to reduce the spending. If we don't do it, we can't get the economy back on track.
Very serious.
So those are the issues that we're addressing here.
Serious matters ahead. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, Republican. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And we have this Fox News alert coming out of New Jersey. Reports that the governor